Thank you for coming today. Those of you who saw the introductory comments, you can see that the film editor is having far more fun with this than we had anticipated. And Bruce, my apologies, we didn't bring music for you. I'd like to talk today about dynamic spatiotemporal brain analyses using high-performance electrical neuroimaging. It's a procedure we've developed recently. Both Stephanie and I will be talking about this approach. I'll be laying down some of the fundamentals and simulation and early research, and Steph will be talking about some more recent research in which this method has been applied. Surface EEGs was first developed and introduced in 1925, so it's only been around 85, 90 years now. And yet we see an underutilization, in part because it was around for a long time, but we didn't have mathematical models and computational procedures for dealing with the large amounts of data that came from EEG. Early research looked at waveforms, they looked at periodicities, relatively simple ways of breaking down this mass of data. But of course, much more information was hidden in the signals that were recorded, especially when we went from a few recording sites, such as we were doing in the 70s, to the 256 or so sites that are being done today. And in the 70s, because we were limited by our computational capacities to relatively simple approaches, we were really reduced to simple questions, like how much global field power was there over the brain. And I don't mean over 256 sites, I mean over a handful of recording sites in the 1020 system. And you can see one was able to publish on using that approach, but using this to say, yes, task A or condition A produced greater global field activation than condition B, and inferring something about overall mentation based on that global field power difference. When event-related brain potentials emerged, there was a great reduction in the information that was provided, and that's because the trials were averaged to produce event-related discrete potentials. And one of the things that we transitioned from when we did that was looking at periodicities in the signal to non-periodicities. When you're doing event-related brain potentials, you're looking for discrete microstates evoked by a stimulus or a task that are unfolding as one performs that task. That is, these mental events are thought to be discrete and different from each other. We're not looking at an oscillator that's repeating. So we moved from periodic to non-periodic analyses, but that actually happened with very little recognition, and the mathematics of periodicity were carried with us, and that actually has produced some confusion in terms of what we were getting out of these signals. Now, these signals became more plentiful. As I said, 128, 256 systems are relatively common now, so this high-density EEG array gives us a wealth of information at a single source. We do average across two conditions. We might compare the amplitude and the latency of the potentials, often described by the morphological peaks in these average event-related brain potentials, and examine microstates as if they were marked by these morphological peaks. Again, one was able to publish in advance, we think, research using these methods, but they've still grossly underestimated the information carried in electrical neuroimaging. Now, in the 90s, when event-related brain potentials were being used in EEG, we also had an emergence of fMRI. And with fMRI, we got spatial specification, which we could not do with EEG. So who wouldn't like to play with a new toy on the block? There was this movement toward fMRI as the better procedure. It is better for spatial identification, but it has its own limits. One of the limits is that it's really expensive. EEG is not cheap, but it looks inexpensive compared to fMRI, where a magnet might cost $2 or $3 million and $1 million or around $800, $1,000 a year to maintain and staff. And so we end up running small sample sizes because we as users have to pay for those costs. And that means the individual subjects are very expensive. Every hour in the magnet is expensive. And so because of that, fMRI research, and we're not unique, so is animal research, is characterized by small sample sizes. And what has become evident is that with small sample sizes, we're only able to see large effects. And when the true effect sizes are small to moderate, which you might think is the case with the echoes of mental events to the brain, then you end up with as likely a large effect being a spurious effect as being a true effect, which creates a bit of a chaotic condition, especially when we don't report the non-significant small to moderate effects. Now, over time, small effect sizes and small sample sizes will not become a problem if we report all the effect sizes. I say that because meta-analyses can be done where we average across large numbers of studies and large numbers of subjects, and looking at the effects from the small effects, we can determine which of those are real, which of the moderate sizes are real, and which of the large effects are real. If we're limited to the large effect sizes, then we're going to have more of the effects being false than true, and we're going to miss some of these small effects. I'll give you an example. In early 2000s, there was an important science paper published on social exclusion, and it showed that there was dorsal cingulate and anterior cingulate in particular that was activated. It turned out this part was part of the pain metrics, which led to a very influential proposal that social pain is utilizing the physical pain matrix, co-opting, if you will, that physical pain matrix. A very provocative and important proposal. Now, there were only 13 subjects in that study, and when you look at what the data showed, you can see that it was a stunningly linear effect. Not to say that this isn't true, but one wouldn't want to place a lot of stock in the correlation of 13 subjects, regardless of what the measurement median is. We recently, thinking that that effect was true, had planned to do neural lesion studies. Stephanie was going to take the lead on that and said, let's first do meta-analyses to the social rejection study and determine what are the specific sites of this so that we can give the neurologists a focus on what sites of lesions would be of greatest interest. And when we did that, to our surprise, we didn't find dorsal anterior cingulate activity. Now we're dealing with sample sizes of 256 instead of 13. We did see a period of the anterior cingulate. It was an area involved in expectancy violation. When someone's throwing the ball around and all of a sudden you're excluded, that violates your expectancy. That did turn out to be a reliable area of the anterior cingulate that was activated. We did not, however, find the pain region of the dorsal anterior cingulate to be activated unless we went down to 1 voxel. The second problem with fMRI is, of course, its temporal resolution is relatively poor compared to EEG. And so EEG has made something of a comeback using it to analyze temporal specification of specific component processes. But that, of course, brings us back to how do we identify those component processes. A proposal in the 90s and pursued in the early 2000s was that one can identify these microstates, these discrete operations calculated by a set of brain areas, activated or co-activated at once, and then move to some other set of neural mechanisms that are activated, performing a separate computation, and moving likewise to the brain, that one can identify that, and in their method, they use K-cluster, means cluster analysis, and it's a relatively simple mathematical procedure that simply looks at how similar are the correlations across time. It assumes it's a periodic mathematical approach, so you can identify multiple microstates using that, and these are clusters of similar brain activity as defined by the 128 or 256 electrode sensor space. I'm going to call that a vector space, n-dimensional vector space, where n represents the number of electrodes, and it's an n-dimensional surface or sensor space. When those are similar correlations, that is, they're similar maps, then they're clustered and identified as a microstate. When there's another group similar, that's a microstate. And you end up with this series of discrete brain microstates. Now, sometimes the same pattern can be seen early and later in the period. Those mathematically would be said to be the same computation or set of operations, but they're not treated that way because, of course, we all think that as we move forward, discrete events or calculations are being performed. What we did was to take a different approach. We rethought. Rather than using periodic mathematics, we brought in non-periodic, a series of computations that we performed on the EEG signal. And just to give you an idea, this is a sample of the data with which we're working. We have a 128K system. Let's say that you have about 500 sampling rate, maybe 500 trials. You have 500 millisecond baseline and 1,000 millisecond task rate and 50 subjects. It gives you 2,400,000,000 data points. You can see why for the first several decades of research on the EEG, that was simply overwhelming. What we have developed using what we call the high-performance microsegmentation suite is tools in which we begin by looking at the signal and no longer asking what's the correlation of the template maps, the topographical maps from each millisecond of recording to other topographical maps, but rather we look at this series and we say, tell us from bottom up, tell us where there are changes from the predicted. So we have a model. That model is based on prior series of topographical maps, where topographical map is the EEG representation of the voltage across the scalp on any millisecond of recording, to subsequent ones. This is a video compression technique algorithm, and we use that video compression algorithm as a means of identifying when there's been a, if you will, scene shift in what the brain is doing. So you end up with a lot of topographical maps like this. You then identify a stable state. You identify separate discrete states, or at least different states. And then you can go back and identify timing, onset, offset, characteristic features. You can do source localization and identify underlying processes. Now, as I mentioned, this mathematical approach was different, and it actually yielded very quickly a different conceptual representation of what we were looking at. This is an early model or simulation that we did, and you simply have here, I think it's 20 topographical maps. The first 7 or so are identical, the last 7 or so are identical, and we have a transition that's linear from the first state to the second state. Just like you would expect in brain activity, you might have the occipital activity on a visual stimulus moving toward more complex analyses in anterior regions of the brain, but that shift isn't immediate, there's a transit time. So we found this transition period, which you see is the ascent in that curve. This curve is the error in prediction. In the microstates that are stable, you see there's no error in prediction. As it starts to change, there's an error in prediction. At the peak of error, we get to a new microstate, and we know that's a new microstate onset because it's now better at predicting subsequent states, topographical maps that are there, and so that descent, in fact, until you get another rise, you have another microstate, because as you can see, if that microstate stays constant, then you will have zero prediction error just as before. So it's the decline till the next rise that's the next discrete microstate. But we now have also these transition periods that are introduced. So that's the idea, is to break it down. Now, we do one other thing. Once we know where those microstates are, and it's important to know where those microstates are first, but once we do know where they are, we go back and we re-represent these microstates in an n-dimensional vector space. In this case, 128-dimensional vector space. Now, I've shown you 2-dimensional space here, and this is actually just a very small portion, a quarter of a 2-dimensional space, but you can get an idea of what we're doing here. T1 through T3 or 4 here all represent individual topographical maps. The T, the very solid line, is the template map. That's the average vector of all those individual vector projections. The dotted lines are the standard deviation boundary conditions around that template vector. The nice thing about representing it in a vector space is that any similarity in configuration will produce exactly the same angle in that template vector in n-dimensional space. If it is the same configuration but it's a greater global field power, the vector gets longer. In any other approach, correlational approaches or the RNSE, it could look like there was a template change. But in fact, when you do it in vector space, you see that the template is simply lengthened. That's how global field power changes. The size or length of that vector. If the subsequent topographical maps differ, you simply look at whether that template map falls within the confidence interval of this template map. If so, you collapse those because they're the same. They simply differ in extremity or intensity, global field power. If they're different, then they're statistically different. So that's actually our statistical test. It's whether the template maps of two discrete subsequent states fall outside of the confidence intervals of the antecedent. And this is just a quick one of many simulations we've done. We put in known signals. Here you see 128 sensors. You can see in the bottom, it's very quiet. And then we create a shift. We create a signal where there's anterior-posterior differences. You notice that we go into a linear shift of that, so we reverse, and it moves from a posterior-anterior pattern of activation. Now we add noise, and we add quite a bit of noise in these simulations. You can see that. And then we average it, so that's what the middle and bottom panels are. Standard processing procedure. And the top panel here shows you the RMSE results, and indeed it identifies two discrete states. When we apply that in the n-dimensional vector space, we in fact find them to be two discrete states. We do one other thing, and that is we do bootstrapping. We do bootstrapping in very, very large numbers, and the numbers billions and trillions. It's absolutely feasible and reasonable. There's reasons you would do that. This is just the sum of 1,000 simulations. What you see, we identify these templates across these bootstraps with very high accuracy of both the onsets and the offsets of them. And what this bottom is a metric we've done about how many of the possible simulations that were ran within the 5 millisecond or 5% of the onset latency of the discrete state. You can see they all did. So it performs exceptionally well, and it's also highly robust and replicable across subjects within that sample. What I'm showing you here is a checkerboard study. This is the occipital representation of the evoked potential in a simple checkerboard study that we ran. And what you have here is the RMSE, and you see 5 microstates. Now that's some are very early, and you can see we have transitions and subsequent microstates. There's the onset, offset, so you can see the timing of each discrete state. As I said, with the bootstrapping, you can look at the variability of the timing of those, so you have some accuracy information about those parameters and get replicability. The 128-dimensional vector analysis produced exactly the same microstate structure, so this is stable. We then, with that information, did source localization analyses, and you end up with a map that looks something like this, with the template maps being the Pepsi-looking maps on the diagonal, and both above and below that are the neuroanatomical representations of likely source localization. Now, this is a hypothesis that can then be tested in fMRI studies. In fact, many fMRI studies have been done of this, and what you see is, in fact, what is found in the fMRI studies, but we know when the regions were activated in the sequence in which they were activated. So the first template you see is visual cortical activity. You can see that in the maps as well. And they're discrete because it's slightly different regions of visual cortex that are active. It then moves up in the third map to perihippocampal region. Now that is a region that's not found often in small sample sizes in humans. However, it has been found in larger sample studies using monkeys as subjects in the checkerboard paradigm. Then what you see in this later state is a movement back to the precuneus and then forward to the anterior cingulate as you await, or as the subjects await, the next checkerboard switch. This is a 500 millisecond checkerboard switching back and forth. And you see about halfway through, 250 milliseconds, they're done looking at the stimulus and basically waiting for the next presentation. So that's the basic approach that we're taking and some of the things, some of the information that we're getting from it. And at this point, I would like to answer questions, but since I'm unable to, what I'd like to do is to invite you to email me at cacioppo@uchicago.edu, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much.